Hey, it's Steven from Trip of a Lifestyle, and I'm going to show you a trick to calculate the interest rate on I bonds, also known as Series I savings bonds, in any year before the US Treasury officially announces that interest rate. This can sometimes allow you to act preemptively and buy I bonds at an especially advantageous time. Now, before I get into that, I do want to be honest and remind you that the majority of my investment portfolio is actually not in I bonds. It's in simple passive stock and bond market index funds, which I think over the long run are actually better investments than I bonds. But because I bonds are sometimes exploitable using little tricks like this one, I think they're a pretty fun investment to keep track of. And when conditions are exactly right, like they have been in 2022, I bonds can actually be a higher return and lower risk investment than pretty much anything else. Before we get started on this trick, let me remind you really quick about the basics of I bonds. First of all, they technically have a 30-year term. They're actually 30-year bonds, but you don't actually have to hold them for 30 years, and I really don't recommend holding them for 30 years. In the first 12 months, you can't redeem them or sell them at all, so you're locked in for at least a year. After that, in years 1 through 5 of holding, you can redeem them anytime you want, but you'll have to pay 3 months worth of interest as a redemption penalty. In years 5 through 30, there's no penalty at all. You can take your money out with interest whenever you want. Now, the interest rate on I bonds isn't constant. It changes every 6 months. And there's two pieces to that interest rate. A fixed rate, which is the same for the entire term of the bond. You know it when you buy it. And the inflation rate, which is the main return of an I bond, and it's based on recent inflation data. Now, the Treasury publishes these interest rates, so you're going to know the interest rate you're buying into when you buy your I bond. So you might be wondering, why am I so concerned with calculating I bond interest rates before the government publishes them? Well, here's why that's important. The official rates are announced at the beginning of May and November every year by the US Treasury. Using the trick in this video, we can actually predict those rate announcements every April and October, a couple weeks early. Now, if you wait for the official announcement to buy in May or November, you're going to get 6 months at the new rate that was just announced. Then 6 months later, your rate is going to reset to a mystery rate. And remember, you have to hold I bonds for at least 12 months. So if you buy in May or November, when a new rate is announced, you'll get 6 months at the rate you agreed to, but then you'll get 6 more months at a rate that could be terrible. On the other hand, if you buy early, just before a new announcement in April or October, you're going to get 6 months at the existing rate, which hopefully is a good one, and then 6 more months guaranteed at the new rate, which you already know in advance. Now, to do this prediction, you're going to need a special number called CPI-U. Don't worry too much about that right now, because I'm going to show you exactly where to get it in a minute or two when we do an example calculation. For now, let's just focus on the formulas. Remember, I bonds have an inflation rate and a fixed rate, so let's focus on the inflation rate first. If it's currently October and you want to know the upcoming November inflation rate on I bonds, you're going to take the September CPI-U number, divide it by the March CPI-U number from the same year, multiply by 2, and then finally subtract 2. What you're left with is called the annualized or yearly inflation rate on the I bond. Now, if it's currently April and you want to know the upcoming May rate, what you're going to do is take this March's CPI-U number, divide by last year's September CPI-U number, again multiply by 2, and subtract 2. You're left with an annualized inflation rate. By the way, this number might come out negative, and if it does, that's fine. Just leave it negative. We're going to deal with it later. The second part of your I bond interest rate is called the fixed rate, and to be honest, it doesn't matter as much as the inflation rate. It's typically lower, but we'll deal with it anyway. If you want to calculate the fixed rate early, there's no precise way to do that. We have to make an estimate. But like I said, the fixed rate is pretty small anyway, so this doesn't affect our calculation too much usually. A lot of times, the fixed rate is actually 0%. So if you want to be conservative, you can just assume the fixed rate is going to renew at 0%. If you want to be a little bit optimistic, but still realistic, assume that the fixed rate is going to renew at the same rate as short duration TIPS, or Treasury inflation protected securities. If TIPS are yielding negative right now, then just go ahead and assume 0%. The fixed rate on I bonds can never go below 0%. The next step's really easy. We're going to take those two numbers and make a composite rate. Your composite I bond interest rate is equal to the inflation rate plus the fixed rate. If the sum of those two is negative, round it up to 0%. The composite rate of an I-bond can also never be less than 0. Now let's do an example. I'm going to pick one from the past so we can see the way that everything worked out. Then we'll do one for the future. We're going to pretend it's April 2022 right now, and we're trying to predict the I-bonds rate for May 2022. To do that, we're going to need the CPI-U number from this March and last September. So let's go look that up really quick. Looking at this online table, we can see that CPI-U was 287.504 in March 2022, and it was 274.310 in September 2021. Those are the two numbers that we need to do our calculation. When we plug them into our formula, we see that the answer comes out to 9.62%. And guess what? That's the actual inflation rate that the Treasury announced in May 2022. Only we were able to see it in April 2022. Back in April 2022, TIPS yields were negative, so we would definitely want to predict that the fixed rate would be 0%. And guess what? It did turn out to be 0%. So the total composite interest rate for I-bonds in May 2022 was 9.62%, exactly as predicted in April. Now let's try one for the future. As of the recording date of this video, it's September 2022, and we'd like to know the I-bonds rate in November 2022. To do this calculation, we're going to need September CPI-U data and March CPI-U data from this year. But whoops, September CPI-U data isn't available yet. It won't become available till mid-October. That's why I say this calculation is better done in October or April. But just for fun, let's do it anyway. We'll just assume that September's CPI-U number will be the exact same as it was in August. That's probably not true, but it's close enough. We'll plug the numbers into our formula, and we get an inflation rate of 6%. So our rough prediction is that I-bonds are going to have an inflation rate of around 6% come November. Now, we could be pessimistic and say the fixed rate is just going to be 0% again, like it was last time. But actually, if you take a look at TIPS data, we see that TIPS are yielding about 1.1% right now, much higher than they were before. So if we want to be optimistic, we could say the fixed rate may jump as high as 1.1%. That would put the composite rate for I-bonds purchased in November 2022 at around 7.1%. Now remember, that is totally an estimate. We're doing this calculation in September when we're supposed to wait until October to do it. So our numbers are definitely going to be a little bit off, but 7% is probably reasonably close to the composite rate that we'll see in November. You can try this trick in any year you want. And since it works so well in April or October of every year, those are really great months to consider whether to buy I-bonds. Remember, the official Treasury rate resets every May or November, around the beginning of those months. But we can predict those new rates early every April and October, around the middle of those months. In April and October, we can buy in at the current rate and know the renewal rate that we'll get 6 months later. That's a pretty sweet trick. As a result, it's best to consider strategic I-bond purchases every April and October, since you have access to both the current and the future rates at those times. If that sounds a little confusing, I have an entire detailed video about exactly how that works and why I personally only consider buying I-bonds every April and October. It also discusses how to tell if I-bonds are a good buy at any given time. So make sure you check it out, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. If you like this kind of stuff, don't forget to subscribe or follow along on your favorite social media platform.